Hey guys, Kia from Kegland, and I must say, with our corny kegs, they're one thing that I'm very proud of. High quality, they're one of the few NSF approved kegs, and we give a 10-year warranty because we're so confident of the quality of the kegs that we manufacture. However, we have made a drastic mistake. We have totally stuffed up, and that is one thing, which is the O-ring in the lid of the keg. If we go back 20 years when I was sort of getting into home brewing, O-rings in kegs were mostly made out of nitrile, and nitrile was great. It had a great oxygen barrier property, but it had this one problem that it perished, and also, well, two problems: it perished, and then also the second thing is it went a little bit flat over time. So if you use the keg under a bit of pressure, the lid's pushing up against the O-ring, you'd end up with a big flat spot, and if you take the keg lid off and put it back on a slightly different orientation, that flat spot would then cause it to leak because it wouldn't be sort of nesting with the two sides of the keg lid neck and the keg lid itself. So that was a bit of an issue, and the whole industry, not just us ourselves, but a lot of other people also started to switch out to silicone O-rings. And we made this massive mistake and went along with everybody else because customers requested it and wanted silicone because it was very springy. Springy in the sense that when you push it down, even if you push it down for a long period of time, you let go and it just springs back instantly. So that O-ring spring was this, attribute which a lot of people loved. It was also very soft and stretchy. So if you had a dented keg lid, worked really great, would seal that up. However, we ended up creating ourselves a massive problem with oxygen transmission, which is exactly why we're doing this video, and it's exactly why we did the testing. So some of you guys will notice now our O-rings are yellow in color. So on the boxes, we've got this Low2 O-ring, fresher, longer sort of, graphic and stuff there. And really this video will start to make sense why we've started to do this, why all these new O-rings are yellow in color, and the amount of effort that we've gone to try to make sure your beer is kept in the best possible condition. So this is Bruce from GunnLab, and he's been a professional in the industry for over 30 years, measuring packaging, and he set up this lab. And this type of lab is an expensive lab with literally millions of dollars worth of machinery in here. And usually people would come to you, not necessarily home brewers, because a test do cost a couple $1,000s, but people would come to you for all sorts of packaging testing. And why would they get their packaging tested, Bruce?
Well, the integrity of the packaging makes a big difference to the shelf life of the product. And people want to know what the shelf life is. And if they get a much shorter shelf life than what they expect, it will cost them potentially many millions of dollars. So a couple of $1,000s worth of testing up front is a very, very good insurance against the unexpected going wrong.
Yes, definitely. And look, to be honest with you, this type of testing is not really economical for a home brewer because it is a couple $1,000s, and we paid a couple $1,000s as well for it. So, this type of testing on an O-ring, I think it really comes down to us to pay the money, because for the benefit of our customers, they need to know the results. And I think, each individual customer can't pay for it, but certainly, for us as a company, I think it's something that we should do for our customers so they got that peace of mind. But some of the testing we're doing here is related to CO2. Also, Bruce does you do packaging technology on certain different closures, is that correct?
Yes, closures and all types of packaging really, or primary packaging, not so much boxes that go around the outside, but the primary packaging that contacts the product is what we test.
Yep. So I think, for instance, film testing is something that you do?
We do a lot of film testing, yes.
Yep.
That was my background. I spent time in the film industry before I set up the lab. Yes.
Yeah, and water transmission, and you were mentioning even the closures, like the amount of force to pull off a closure or crack a lid open, and you did a lot of testing for the wine industry, I think, in that regard.
That's right, yes. We've tested a huge range of products, not only food packaging, but the building industry and the pharmaceutical industry, and quite a range of industries.
Yep. Well, that's enough of the lab. The machines are a bit noisy in here, and they're constantly making this sort of whirring sound. So let's sit down. I'm going to ask you a few questions about the testing that we did. But just so people are understanding the test before we leave, the machine that we've got here, this particular type of machine, what's it doing here? And it's probably good to explain why we got a top of a keg and welded it onto a plate like this rather than the entire keg.
Okay, well this one is called, it's an oxygen permeability tester. It's called a Mocon Ox-Tran, which is the most common and industry-leading instrument for that purpose. So We can test a wide range of formats in it. We can test films and filled pouches and bottles and jars and so on. And for testing O-rings of kegs, we've worked together with Kegland and we'll come up with this device here, which is a keg top. We can't use a whole keg because the interior volume is so much that the flow of gas that's going through for the test would be too low for the volume there. You know, with minute changes in temperature as it expands and contracts, the flow rate would be interrupted. So we have to use a fairly small free volume. So that's why we've just used the top, which is the part that holds the O-ring, of course.
Yeah.
So we feed a carrier gas from the instrument through these pipes here into the space which simulates the keg, and atmospheric oxygen comes through the O-ring, and we detect how much oxygen is coming into the system.
Yep. Yeah, fantastic. So essentially what we're doing is reducing the volume of the keg to increase the sensitivity of the test, I suppose, because if it's diluted oxygen over a large keg, it's harder to read, and therefore the threshold of measurement is probably going to be not as good, I suppose. Now, this type of setup, generally with the copper tubes, obviously they're impermeable, and you know, the copper tubes are epoxied onto the lid. Now, obviously you could weld them, but epoxy is also considered generally negligible in terms of its oxygen transmission rate, so the epoxy glue itself.
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So technically, if you wanted to totally eliminate oxygen from your keg, you could also epoxy the lid closed too, and that would do the job, but obviously that means you wouldn't be able to open it.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's get into the other questions, and let's get into the results as well. So with respect to the test results here, these test results are really were quite alarming, and I think we're going to put these up online, and when you see them and see the test results, I think a lot of you guys at home are going to be quite surprised at the difference between the two O-ring types. But firstly, I'd like to tackle a common misconception with O-rings and packaging in general, where people think that if the packaging is under pressure, that somehow that's going to prevent oxygen from, getting into the vessel. Is that correct?
No, it's a total myth. Basically, oxygen molecules are very, very small, and when they're passing through a material, they're a very small part of the overall picture, and the likelihood that it's going to block a CO2 molecule coming the other way is negligible. In fact, the likelihood of it coming anywhere near a CO2 molecule going in the opposite direction is pretty negligible. So the gas, the oxygen coming in and the CO2 going out are totally independent, and the CO2 will have no effect whatsoever on the oxygen coming through.
So it's sort of like a diffusion process, I guess. Like it just diffuses and will eventually want to become as long as that material can permeate oxygen, it will eventually diffuse irrespective of the pressure in the vessel. Is that fair to say?
That's correct, yes. Now, there is a big difference between permeability and leaking. Some people think that that oxygen transmission is due to oxygen going through leaks or holes. It's not that whatsoever. The oxygen actually dissolves in the plastic material, and it moves through the intact plastic or rubber material, and then when it gets to the other side, it evaporates off the surface. So it's leaking and permeability are totally different. Two separate processes.
Yes, I see. So one thing you could possibly do, presumably, is also limit the amount of, rubber, seals and stuff like that. But obviously, people love these types of kegs because you can take the whole lid off and get your arm in for cleaning and so forth. But obviously that large surface area and large cross-sectional area that it can sort of permeate through really comes at a bit of a cost, I suppose.
Yes, if you double the available area for permeation, you're going to double the amount of oxygen that passes through and double the amount of CO2 that comes out.
Yeah, and would it be fair to say it's generally a linear relationship most of the time between the thickness of the material and the surface area? So, or is there a sort of logarithmic type of relationship between the types of materials?
It is linear. So you double the area, you'll double the transmission rate. Halve the thickness, you'll double the transmission rate. And likewise, if you double the thickness, you'll halve the transmission rate.
Yep, great. So with the results in this test, we basically put the 2 O-rings on the test. We had our, Yellow Low2 O-rings, and we had the Silicone O-rings. How did the test results actually compare?
There was a huge difference. The Yellow O-rings had basically about 1/27th of the transmission of the Silicone ones. So that will relate to the ability of the packaging of the O-ring to protect the beer.
Yep. So literally, if you're saying that shelf life is determined by oxygen, is what we normally say in the beer industry. For a light lager, if we will get 100, parts per billion into that packaging, then a light lager would have a noticeable cardboardy type taste, or a taste which is noticeable by a consumer. I guess that means, one O-ring compared to the other will literally have a 27 times difference in its, shelf life based on that finite limit. Is that correct, Bruce?
Yes, approximately. Yes.
Does moisture, have any effect on the permeability? I would imagine that, we did this test in a laboratory, but also if you were going to have wet environment, would that make any difference to the test results? And was there any testing done in that respect?
Yes, we did the test with high humidity and low humidity, and we found that for these materials there was very little difference, or little or no difference. Some materials do make a difference, and a lot of high barrier materials do actually have significantly worse oxygen transmission rate when they are moist than they do when they're dry. With rubbery materials, most of them are relatively independent of moisture, but other materials, and we are seeing that with some of the clean and green biodegradable materials coming in, that some of them perform very well when they're dry and absolutely awfully when they're wet.
Yep.
But certainly for these O-ring materials, we have found that moisture doesn't make a difference to the oxygen transmission rate.
Now, with respect to CO2 loss, it's also a bit of a concern. I mean, oxygen is primarily our main concern, because obviously when oxygen comes in, the beer is damaged. If we lose a bit of CO2, especially in a keg, we can always just charge it up and recarbonate it. But is there any sort of relationship between CO2 and oxygen transmission? Is there anything that we need to be concerned about there, or is there anything we can deduce from this type of report, which would relate to potentially CO2 as well?
Yes, the CO2 transmission is closely related to the oxygen transmission. It's directly proportional. So there are published guides that will tell you for a particular polymer a figure that you can use to predict the CO2 transmission rate based on the O2 transmission rate.
So would it be fair to say that because they're highly linked, if we had 27 times more oxygen transmission, then it would probably be approximately 27 times more CO2 loss from the keg as well?
It would, yes.
Yep. How does the temperature affect the oxygen transmission rate? That's also something, because I imagine that, some kegs which would be stored at a cold temperature, it might be slightly better, but it's obviously not going to completely solve this problem. Generally speaking, most reactions will be slowed down to some degree when molecules aren't moving as fast, I suppose. Is that the case with this type of testing?
Definitely. Transmission rates are highly dependent on temperature. I've done the calculations in the past. There's a fairly complex exponential relationship, but in the temperatures that we normally work with, say between 0 and 40 degrees, there's a rough rule of thumb that for most plastic materials, for every 1 degree of temperature increase, there'll be somewhere between a 2% and a 10% increase in transmission. So if you make a difference in, say, 10 degrees in temperature, you might double the transmission rate, just approximately.
Yep.
So we can test at a range of temperatures, but it becomes more difficult to test at very low temperatures, mainly because the test takes a lot longer at a low temperature than it does at a high temperature. So from a testing point of view, it's easier, cheaper and more convenient to do it at a higher temperature, and be aware that decreasing the temperature will decrease the transmission quite drastically.
Yeah, that's a really important thing, because I think a lot of people don't realise the importance of refrigerating the beverage as well. If you can refrigerate your kegs, you should, not only to keep the product fresh, but also, well, to keep the product fresh from the perspective of you slowing the reactions in the keg, but you're also slowing down the transmission rate through any seals as well. So, you know, that's always a good idea. If you have an extra spare fridge to put your spare kegs in, do that rather than leaving them out in the open. So Bruce, with respect to plastics in general, plastics like polypropylene, polyethylene, PET and nylon, you know, or even silicone for that matter, are there sort of general sort of rules of thumb and which is better than another that we sort of need to be aware of, or should be trying to push in one direction or another?
There are huge differences between different plastics, which is why you use multi-layer structures in many cases, you know, particularly for films and so on. Not so much for beverage seals, but often the materials that have the best oxygen transmission properties will not have the best strength or the best water vapor transmission or whatever. So, but talking specifically about oxygen transmission, you've got your common materials like polyethylene, polypropylene, PVC and so on, which are widely used but have a very poor oxygen barrier. So you want to go for specialised materials like nylons, PVDC and even metal barriers. Yeah, the choice of plastic makes a big difference as to the transmission rate.
Yeah, because a metal barrier, like a Mylar sort of type film, obviously is a perfect barrier. It's got a piece of metal in there, so it just cannot, no matter how thin that metal is, it just can't permeate over that metal barrier as long as it's a continuous piece of metal, I suppose.
That's correct. Yeah. That's why you see some bottles with induction sealed foils on the top that you have to peel off. And, that provides an excellent barrier.
Yeah. And nylon, you know, for instance, our PET kegs, we blend nylon into those kegs, you know, to form a mono barrier where it basically blends in. So typically, have you done much of that testing where they've had a nylon dispersed within the PET to block oxygen?
We have done a limited amount of testing on that basis, but fortunately with a keg, the walls are quite thick, so you can use the thickness to get a decent barrier.
All right, well that pretty much wraps it up for the questions. I will really thank Bruce for his time. He hasn't been paid for this interview or anything like that. We paid for the testing obviously, but he's donated his time for this interview because I thought it would be really interesting for our customer base. If we've got any breweries out there who want to test their packaging or buying a new type of packaging, highly recommend sending it to Bruce. It's worth a couple $1,000s to spend the money on making sure that you've got good packaging which can extend that shelf life and protect the beverage. Obviously home brewers, like this is totally, you know, not something that you're going to do, but if you home brewers do have another type of packaging you want us to test, then put it in the comments below what you think you would like us to test, and we'll see if we can justify the cost of bringing him over and then getting some more testing done by Bruce. But really want to say thanks, Bruce, for your time. It's great to speak to an expert in the industry who really knows all about this, who can fill in a lot of blank spots and really bust that myth about oxygen transmission, because a lot of people, you know, think because the container's under, you know, some type of pressure that it's somehow protected, but it's really not. Anyway, thanks so much for that, Bruce. I really appreciate it. Cheers. All right, thanks for watching the video, guys. Now, because we openly are admitting we made a mistake here and sold these O-rings, if you have purchased the kegs from us in the past, or even if you've purchased it from one of our distributors in Australia, what we're doing is if you're going to come to our website and place an order, we're going to give you some free O-rings to replace your old ones. So there's a discount code in the comments below, which will work on the kegland.com.au website. So if you guys place an order and have purchased some O-rings, please add some O-rings to your cart, use that discount code, and you'll get a couple of those O-rings for free. Now, of course, they're not expensive O-rings. We're not overcharging for this, even though I put a lot of effort into the testing. So if you do have, you know, some really old kegs, not from us or whatever, honestly, get some replacement O-rings and put them into your keg straight away and throw out those silicone ones. Now, with the test results, I also say, they basically covered the test results in this report, which we're going to put a PDF and link into our comments as well. So just click on that. You'll be able to download the PDF so you can see the actual test results from Bruce. In here, basically, it also says the oxygen is written here as 0.41 centimeters squared per day. So basically, that's the amount of oxygen that's going through the O-ring for the yellow O-rings. And then obviously for the silicon ones, they're 11.3 cubic centimeters per day, which is the amount of transmission. Now, that is a high number. If you translate that into shelf life, so I've got another friend, David Carew, who I've worked with in the past, who is a packaging technologist, helped us with the calculation. But if you translate that into how that affects the shelf life of a light lager, generally light lagers and lighter colored beers, we consider 1 ppm oxygen in the beer itself to be, the limit before that keg is essentially has a noticeably not fresh flavor. Now for stouts and other stuff like that, it certainly, you're going to get, I guess a little bit of protection from that cardboardy type oxidized flavor because it's going to get covered up by essentially the beer style itself for those darker styles or porters. But those IPAs with very hoppy aroma where you want to keep a fresh hop, that's really important. This is where it's going to have a massive impact. But translating that into a storage and shelf life, it's alarming because that amount of oxygen transmission through the O-ring basically equates to 2.5 days with silicon where you're going to get 1 ppm oxygen exposure in the beer. If you got the yellow O-ring, that equates to a 66.5 days. So massive difference. You're going to get a couple months versus a few days. So that's huge. The other thing you got to probably consider, and this was mentioned with Bruce as well, as the temperature drops, it's going to increase the protection as well. So if you guys are storing, let's say at 0 degrees Celsius, the other calculation we did was basically the silicon O-ring is going to extend your shelf life of your life lager out to about 1 week. So that's great, you're getting a week instead of 2.5 days. The yellow one is going to be 176 days. So that basically means you're going to get, approximately 6 months, but a massive difference. A week, 6 months, 27 times, better essentially with this O-ring. So this is why it's so important. Please share the video, especially if you've got a friend who's still using these. Share it for the good of them. Share this video with them. And of course, if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, bottom right-hand corner, hit subscribe now and join our Facebook Homebrew community group. All right, that's it, guys. Hope to see you next time. Bye. You want me to do what with the rings? Look, I don't watch Marvel, Ollie. I don't even know what you're talking about. It's because I'm Asian, isn't it?